Wyoming, October 1889. The sky out here doesn't comfort you, it just watches. A dirt road cuts through sagens in silence, stretching toward mountains that don't care what happens at their feet. Wind moves through dry grass. Nothing else does then. A woman, standing at the edge of the road like she grew there, carpetbag in the dust beside her, shoes worn through, shoulders carrying something heavier than weather. She isn't waiting for anyone. She stopped believing anyone was coming. Hoofbeats, distant, growing. A horse crests the rise, dark bay massive, carrying a man built like the mountains behind him. Silver beard, scarred hands, eyes that have seen enough winters to being surprised by hard things. The horse stops. Nobody told it to. The man looks down at the woman. The woman looks up at the man. Neither of them knows yet. What is about to begin? The road didn't care. That was the thing nobody told you. About grief. About losing everything you'd spent a lifetime building. About walking 6 towns in 3 weeks with nothing but a carpetbag and whatever pride you had left. The road just kept going. Dust and sage and sky, indifferent as a banker's smile. Margaret Wren had learned that lesson well by now, 58 years old. Hands that had kneaded enough dough to fill a county. A back that had bent over enough ledgers to fund a small church. And here she was, standing at the edge of a Wyoming road in October, shoes worn through at the left heel, stomach hollow since yesterday morning, watching the sun drop behind the hills like it had somewhere better to be. Which it did. Everything had somewhere better to be than here. She'd stopped walking about 20 minutes ago. Not because she was tired. She was always tired. She'd stopped because her legs had simply made the decision without consulting her. They'd said, "No, right here, this is as far as we go," and she hadn't argued. The carpetbag sat in the dust beside her. Inside it, one change of clothes, a small Bible that had been her mother's, a folded letter from a bank in Cheyenne, and a photograph of a man named Thomas Wren who'd been dead for 8 months and had left behind nothing but love and debt in equal measure. She didn't take the photograph out. She knew what he looked like. She'd been married to him for 22 years. She knew the shape of his hands and the way he laughed too loud at his own jokes and how he'd always burned the toast but made the best coffee she'd ever tasted. She knew. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that she'd spent 8 months trying to figure out what she was supposed to do next. And she'd tried. Lord, she had tried. 6 towns, 6 front doors, 6 conversations that all ended the same way. Not with words, because they were too polite for words, just with eyes. Eyes that traveled from her face, down, took in the full measure of her, and made their decision before she'd finished saying good morning. Too old, too big, too much trouble. She'd fed 40 logging men in a single sitting. She'd managed the books for her aunt's boarding house for 10 years without losing a single penny. She could diagnose a cracked stove flue by smell alone, and she could make cornbread that grown men wept over. But none of that fit at first glance, so here she was, on a road that didn't care, watching the sun leave. She wasn't looking for anything dramatic. She wasn't. She was just tired. In a way that sleep fixed. In a way that had been building since the morning a bank representative knocked on her door 8 days after Thomas's funeral and smiled at her like it was a courtesy call. She was tired of fighting something she kept losing. The wind picked up. The kind of cold that comes off the mountains in October and means what it says. Maggie pulled her shawl tighter, closed her eyes, listened to nothing, and then a horse stopped. She heard it before she saw it. The particular sound of hooves going from rhythm to halt. Right there on the road, 20 feet from where she stood. She opened her eyes. The horse was a big bay, dark reddish-brown, nearly black in the fading light. It had stopped without being told to. Just stopped, head up, ears forward, looking straight at her. The man on its back looked like something the mountains had decided to set loose into the world. 6 foot something, maybe more. Broad enough, across the shoulders that he blocked the last of the sunlight behind him. Beard gone silver, thick. The kind of beard a man grows not for fashion, but because he's been too busy keeping a ranch alive to think much about his face. He had a coat on, heavy canvas, worn through at one elbow, and hands on the reins that were scarred and weathered and about the size of dinner plates. He was maybe 60, maybe a little past. Hard to tell. The outdoors did things to a face. He looked at her with gray eyes that held no particular expression. Not pity, not suspicion, not the automatic assessment she'd gotten on 6 front porches. Just looking. She thought, now I'm being studied by a horse and whatever carved that man out of granite. Ma'am, he said, voice like gravel rolling around in a tin bucket. Sir, she said back. He didn't move. The horse didn't move. They just stood there, the three of them, in the dying light. You all right? He asked. Fine, she said, which was such an obvious lie that even the horse seemed skeptical. He looked at the carpet bag in the dust, looked at her shoes, looked at her face, not in the way men usually looked at her, not calculating, not dismissive. More like he was reading the situation the way you'd read a fence line, checking methodically for where the trouble was. You're not fine, he said. I didn't ask your assessment, she said, which was rude. She knew it was rude, but she was tired and cold and her left heel hurt, and she was not in the mood to be managed by a stranger on a horse. He didn't seem offended. He also didn't leave. Briggs Calloway, he said. I run a spread 4 miles west of here. He paused. My cook left last night, didn't pack, just rode off, didn't leave a note. Maggie blinked. That was not the conversation she'd expected. I'm sorry to hear that, she said. Third one in 2 sons. She waited. You cook? He asked. And there it was. The world's most sideways job offer. Standing on a dirt road in the middle of October from a man who looked like he'd been assembled from leftover lumber and stubbornness. She almost laughed. Almost. Do I cook? 22 years of boarding house kitchens, 10 years of logging crews, 4 decades of feeding people who thought they were too hungry to be grateful. I cook, she said. $20 a month, he said. Room behind the cookhouse. It's small, but the roof holds. He looked at her steadily. I'm not offering charity, ma'am. I need someone who can feed 12 men who've been eating disaster for 8 weeks. 12 men. She thought about the 6 front porches, about the eyes. You know what, she thought. Why not? Margaret Wren, she said. And I'll need to see the kitchen before I agree to anything. Something that might have been the distant ancestor of a smile crossed his face, gone before she was sure she'd seen it. Fair enough, he said. He reached down. She took his hand. He pulled her up onto the horse with an ease that suggested he regularly lifted things much heavier than a 58-year-old woman with a carpet bag. The horse started moving west without being asked. Neither of them said anything else. The road, for once, was going somewhere. The kitchen was a catastrophe. Not in a dramatic fire and brimstone way. In a quiet, grinding way. The way things fall apart when nobody's paying attention, and everyone's too tired to fix it properly. The stove had a crack along the left side. Not new, weeks old, judging by the scorch marks around it. 3 pots on the shelf with burned residue so thick and old it had become its own geological layer. The flour barrel stood open. October cold had gotten in, and something else had gotten in too. She didn't want to know what. The smell was something between old grease and resignation. Well, Maggie said. Yeah, Briggs said behind her. How long has it been like this? Since Hank retired in August. He leaned against the doorframe. Arms crossed. First replacement burned everything and quit. Second one showed up drunk and left drunker. Third one I thought might actually work. He lasted 6 weeks. A pause. Left last night. Maggie walked to the stove, pressed her palm against the iron, feeling the uneven heat coming off it. She'd need clay for that crack. Then a proper scrub with sand and vinegar. Then she'd need to rebuild the fire correctly. Whoever had been managing this stove hadn't understood that uneven heat didn't come from bad fuel. It came from a compromised draw. Ma'am. She turned. Boy had appeared in the doorway, 17 maybe, thin as a willow branch, big dark eyes under a hat too large for his head. He was looking at her with an expression that could only be described as cautious hope, the kind you give a stray dog that might be friendly or might decide otherwise. Elias Pruitt, Briggs said. He helps around. Elias, this is Mrs. Wren. She'll be cooking. Elias glanced at Maggie, then at the kitchen, then back at Maggie. Running his calculations. You need me to haul water, ma'am? I need you to haul about 40 gallons, she said. And find me every clean rag in this building and throw away whatever's in that flour barrel. All of it. He blinked, then he moved, fast. Good, she thought. I can work with fast. Briggs watched her for a moment. He seemed to want to say something else, decided against it, pushed off the doorframe, and left her to it, which was exactly the right call. What happened in the next 4 hours wasn't a miracle. Maggie didn't believe in kitchen miracles. She believed in method, in sequence, in the discipline of knowing which problem to solve first, and keeping your hands moving while your brain worked 3 steps ahead. Clay packed into the stove crack. She found a patch of it near the water trough, still damp and workable. Fire built slow and even, not fast and flashy. The good pan located and liberated from under two bad ones. Cast iron so thick it would outlast everyone in the building, wiped clean and set over steady heat. She took inventory while the fat rendered. Checked the root cellar with a lamp and found salvations hiding in the back corners. A crock of lard, untouched. Half a side of bacon, properly cured. A dozen jars of preserves from last summer, and tucked behind everything else, wrapped in cloth like someone had hidden it from the disaster around it. A 5-pound sack of cornmeal that smelled exactly like it was supposed to smell. There you are, she thought. Elias collected 9 eggs from hens that seemed almost relieved to be noticed. The hens had opinions about being neglected. Maggie sympathized. By 5:30, the cookhouse smelled like something entirely different. It smelled like someone cared. Maggie stood at the stove, stirring, adjusting, listening to the sounds that told her when heat was right and when it wasn't. Her feet hurt. Her back had several complaints filed and ready. She was operating on a piece of bread from that morning and cold water from the pump. But her hands knew what they were doing. And that was the first thing she'd known for certain in 8 months. A woman appeared at the cookhouse door at 5:55, 60, maybe. Round face. Gray hair pulled back practical. She was carrying something Maggie didn't register at first, and she looked at Maggie with eyes that were simply kind. Not curious, not appraising, just kind, the way some people are kind without making a production of it. She set something on the end of the table, reached into her apron, held out a folded piece of cloth, clean white cotton. Someone had taken time to press it flat. Dorothea Haynes, the woman said. Dot. My husband's worked this ranch going on 15 years. Pause. That's for you. Maggie looked at the tarpaulin. I didn't ask. No. Dot said simply, you didn't, and then she left. Walked back out into the early dark without another word. Maggie stood there a moment holding it. Well, she thought. All right then. She put it on, turned back to the stove. At 6 o'clock, the door opened and they came in. 12 of them. Exactly as advertised. Dust-covered, work-tired, moving with the heaviness of men who'd been doing hard physical labor since before the sun came up. They filed in without talking much, found their seats, and then they stopped, because the room's different. Maggie watched them catch it. That moment when exhausted bodies register something unexpected, and something in the chest just opens, whether they want it to or not. Cornbread, golden brown, bacon laid out on the wide platter, crisped properly, not charred. Eggs scrambled with butter she'd found cold and perfect in the back of the cellar. Coffee black and tough to have a point of view. Simple food. But food made by someone who understood what it was for. One man, older, sitting at the far end, made a sound that wasn't quite a word, picked up the cornbread, looked at it like he was verifying it was real. Go ahead, she thought. It's real. He took a bite and closed his eyes. That was enough. The room went to work on the food with the focus of men who'd been waiting for this, without knowing they were waiting. Plates scraped clean. Hands reached across without hot ceremony. Someone said quietly, Lord Almighty. Someone else laughed for no reason except that laughing felt right. Maggie stayed near the stove, arms crossed, watching, and then August Doyle walked in. She knew it was him before anyone said the name, because he walked differently from the rest. Bigger than most. 50-something, built solid through the chest and shoulders, the kind of man who'd been doing hard work so long it had become structural. He'd been out somewhere. She'd noticed his place at the table empty. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the room, then looked at her. His eyes did the thing she knew. The slow, deliberate travel from her face downward. The measuring, the verdict reached before any evidence was considered. So, he said, to the room more than to her. This is the new cook. Evidently, Maggie said. He looked at the food, back at her. Something in his expression that wasn't quite a smirk. Almost. No offense, ma'am, he said. But I'd think a woman he paused, your size would be more the eating type than the cooking type. The room went very quiet. Maggie looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 6 front porches. About eyes that made their decisions before she opened her mouth. About 8 months of being seen and found lacking by people who'd never once asked what she was capable of. She picked up the coffee pot, walked over to his seat at the table, set down a mug in front of it, filled it without spilling a drop. August Doyle, she said, because she'd made it her business to learn every name before anyone arrived. You've been on this ranch how long? He blinked, surprised she knew his name. 11 years, and you've been eating disaster for 2 months. More or less. Sit down, she said, eat something. Then tell me what I am. She walked back to the stove. He stood there another moment, and then, because there was nothing else to do, and because the bread genuinely smelled incredible, he sat. He picked up the bread, took a bite, chewed slowly. His expression moved through several stages. Skepticism, surprise, something that might, in another man, have been called a reckoning with his own assumptions. He didn't say anything, but he reached for seconds. And that was the closest thing to an apology Maggie expected from a man like that. So she accepted it. Briggs came in last. He always came in last, she'd learn that later. Understand it as one of his fixed habits, like coming in last meant he'd made sure everything outside was settled before he let himself stop. He stood just inside the door, looked at the plates, most of them empty, which around here apparently qualified as a minor miracle, looked at the faces of his men. Something in his expression shifted, small, quiet, the way a man's face changes when he realizes something went right that he'd stopped expecting. He looked at Maggie, she looked back. He nodded once, she nodded once, that was the whole thing. After the men had gone and the plates were stacked and the fire banked for the night, Maggie went outside, just for a minute, to breathe air that didn't smell like grease and effort. The sky above Wyoming was doing what Wyoming skies did, being enormous. Stars from one horizon to the other. No apology for the scale of it. She stood there with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. Well, she thought, you're here, wherever here was. She'd made it through the first evening. The men had eaten. The worst of the kitchen was sorted. She had a room, apparently, with a roof that held. It wasn't much, but it was something to wake up to in the morning. Something her hands could do. Something her brain could organize itself around, instead of circling the same dark territory it'd been circling for 8 months. She was about to go back inside when she heard it, a voice, low. Coming from behind the building, she stopped. It was Briggs. She could tell by the timbre of it, that gravel quality, present even when quiet. But he wasn't talking to anyone she could see. She moved around the edge of the building slowly, not to spy, just to understand what she was hearing. There, behind the cookhouse, set apart from everything else and half hidden by 2 old cottonwood trees whose leaves were almost all gone now. A small grave marker, simple cross, old wood, weathered to gray. Briggs was standing in front of it, hat in his hands, talking in a voice too low to make out words, but she could hear the shape of it, the cadence of someone working through something, the tone of a man talking not to be answered, but because some things needed to be said out loud, into the air where they could exist as something other than weight carried alone. Maggie understood that tone. She used it herself, 3 in the morning, talking to a photograph of Thomas, asking questions she knew had no answers, explaining herself to someone who couldn't respond but who she addressed anyway because the alternative was silence. So complete it became unbearable. Oh, she thought, this big quiet man who'd found her on a road and offered her a transaction instead of charity, he was carrying something too. Not debt, not a failing ranch. Something older than either of those. Something that had been there long before the fences started getting cut and the cooks started quitting. She stepped back before he could know she'd seen, went inside, closed the door softly behind her, lay down on the narrow bed in the small room behind the cookhouse. The roof held. Briggs had been right about that. She slept, and then she didn't. 3 in the morning, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. This had been her pattern since Thomas died. Her brain woke up at 3 like it had an appointment, like it couldn't stop checking whether the hard thing was still true. It was still true. The bank letter was still in the carpet bag. Thomas was still gone. 6 towns had still turned her away without actually looking at her. But she was here. She thought about Dot Haynes and a pressed tarpaulin left without explanation. About Elias hauling 40 gallons without complaint. About August Doyle reaching for seconds without a word. Small things. When the large things are gone, you look for small things. You find the one pan worth saving. You pack clay into the crack. You keep the fire going, you stay. The next morning she found the fence post. She'd gone out early, before anyone else was up, to get water from the pump. She walked the edge of the yard without thinking much about it, just moving, the way she did when her mind needed to work through something. It had been a habit at her aunt's boarding house. walking the perimeter in the early mornings before the building woke up. South fence, post at the corner where the pasture met the property line. Cut, not broken, not rotted through by weather. Cut. The wood at the top was clean across, the kind of clean you only got from a blade drawn deliberately through wood. She crouched down, looked more carefully. The wire had been pulled free and reattached badly, the way someone reattaches something when they want it to look like it worked loose on its own. And they don't expect anyone to get close enough to check. Someone who has assumed nobody would look carefully. Interesting, she thought. She straightened up, looked out at the empty early morning pasture. The mountains in the far distance were going pink at the edges, slow and indifferent. She didn't say anything to Briggs. Not yet. She didn't have enough to say anything useful, and she'd learned that incomplete information presented too early just put people on guard and changed behavior before you understood what behavior you were dealing with. She went back inside, built the fire up, started the coffee. She opened the small notebook she'd found in the back of a kitchen drawer. Somebody's old supply list, half the pages unused, and turned to a clean page. Wrote, fence, corner post, south pasture line. Cut clean with a blade, wire reattached to suggest weather damage. She wrote the date beneath it. October 12, 1889, because if this was what it looked like, if this was the kind of trouble that moves quietly and then all at once, then the dates were going to matter. She'd learned that lesson too late to help herself. She wasn't going to let it be too late here. The coffee came up strong and dark, and boots started hitting the porch steps outside. And Maggie set about her second morning on a ranch she hadn't chosen. In a life she was, one morning at a time, beginning to choose anyway. One pot of coffee, one noted date, one small deliberate act of paying attention. 3 weeks in, that's how long it took for the ranch to stop feeling like someone else's problem and start feeling like hers, which was dangerous. She knew that. You didn't go around feeling ownership over things that weren't yours. Not at 58. Not when you'd already lost everything you'd built your whole life assuming would stay. But the kitchen was hers now in every way that mattered. The system she'd built, where everything lived, how supplies rotated, which pots ran hot, which shelf Elias could reach without a step stool, all of it hers. The men knew it too. They came in at 6 and the food was there, and nobody questioned anymore whether it would be good. It was always good. That part she'd handled, the other part, the part she'd written down in her notebook with the date beside it, that was still waiting. She kept adding to the notebook. Not every day, only when there was something worth recording. A second fence post, this one on the east line, found by one of the hands who mentioned it to Briggs and didn't think twice about it. A delivery of lumber that arrived 3 days early, signed in by someone whose name she didn't recognize. The paperwork left on the cookhouse table like an afterthought. Small things. But small things had a way of adding up to something large if you were paying attention. Briggs noticed her writing in it once. Didn't ask what it was. Just looked at it the way he looked at most things, steadily, without rushing toward a conclusion, and went back to his coffee. She appreciated that about him, the not rushing. It was a Tuesday morning when he set the ledgers on the kitchen table. No ceremony, no explanation. Just 2 thick books with cracked spines landing on the wood in front of her, and Briggs saying, "I was told you managed accounts." "For 10 years, she said. "These haven't been managed," he said. In a while, she looked at the books. Back at him. How long is a while? He picked up his coffee. A define while, oh Lord, she thought. She opened the first book and immediately understood why 3 cooks had quit, and why the whole operation smelled of barely controlled chaos, even when the food was good. Because it wasn't just the kitchen that had been falling apart. The entire financial backbone of the ranch was held together with hope and stubbornness and very little else. Supply invoices filed out of sequence, receipts missing for whole months, payments recorded twice in one column and not at all in another. She worked through breakfast, through the morning lull, through the noon meal which Elias managed with supervision. He brought her a plate around midday that she ate without looking up from the page. And then, somewhere in the second book, October invoices the month before she arrived. A signature on a supply receipt for lumber, dated 6 weeks back, Denny Falk. She looked at it for a long moment, then turned the page. Another receipt, different materials. Same name signed at the bottom. Denny Falk was the ranch's carpenter. She knew him. Quiet man, 30-something, compact and careful, in the way of someone who worked with precise measurements all day. He came to meals, ate fast, left fast, never caused trouble, never said much beyond what was required. But a carpenter didn't sign for grain deliveries. A carpenter didn't authorize feed corn purchases. That was the ranch foreman's job, or Briggs himself. Not the carpenter. She turned the page. Found two more. Same name. Different dates. Different suppliers. Why, she thought, would a carpenter be signing supply invoices? She wrote all 4 entries in her notebook. The dates, the amounts, the suppliers' names. Then she closed the ledger, made a fresh pot of coffee, and went to find Denny Falk. He was in the barn, working on a broken stall door, replacing the lower hinge with the focused attention of a man who was very deliberately not looking up when someone walked in. "Mr. Falk," she said. "Mrs. Wren." Still not looking up, she stood there, let the silence do its work. He kept his eyes on the hinge he was fitting, but his hand slowed, then stopped. "I've been going through the supply ledgers," she said. He set down the hinge. "Your name comes up," she said. In places it doesn't quite make sense. He still didn't look at her. His jaw was working through something. "I didn't take anything," he said. "I want you to know that first. I didn't steal a single cent from this ranch." "I know," she said. He looked up then, surprised she'd said it so quickly. "I can see it in the numbers," she said. "If you were stealing, there'd be gaps. What I see instead are additions, things being ordered that weren't needed. Deliveries timed in particular ways." She paused. Someone was buying access. Silence stretched between them, long enough that she heard the horses shifting in their stalls. "Mr. Falk," she said, "I'm not here to report you to Mr. Calloway. I'm here because I want to understand what's actually happening on this ranch." He looked at her for a long time. And something in his face, a tightness she'd noticed without naming it, the look of a man holding something heavy at a bad angle for too long, cracked slightly at the edges. "My wife," he said, "Clara, and my boy." He looked back at the stall door. "He's 4 years old. His name is Robert." He said the names the way you say the names of things you're afraid of losing. "There's a man in town," he continued, "Harlan Voss. Runs the bank and half of everything else if you look closely enough. We borrowed money 3 years back when Clara got sick. The medical costs were," he stopped, started again, "more than we had. The interest grew faster than I could work it down. And then one day Voss sent someone to tell me he'd call the full loan if I didn't help him." "Help him how?" Maggie said, flat. She already knew the shape of the answer, information. When Calloway goes out to the far pasture, when deliveries come, when all the men are occupied in the same place. He rubbed his face with one hand, slow and tired. "I signed for deliveries that gave his people reason to be on the property. Access they wouldn't have had otherwise. That's what he called it, access. That's not all he's used it for," she said. "I know." His voice broke on the second word. Just slightly. "I know what's been happening. The fence is getting cut. The equipment going missing." He didn't tell me what the information was for. Not at the start. And by the time I understood, he shook it. I didn't know how to stop without losing everything. Maggie was quiet for a moment. She thought about a bank letter arriving 8 days after a funeral. A man in a suit explaining in careful language why the house Thomas had built with his own hands now belonged to an institution. The particular cruelty of paperwork as a weapon, dressed up in the vocabulary of business necessity. She thought about Thomas. Then she set that aside. She needed to think clearly. "Robert," she said. "He's 4, yes." "All right, Mr. Falk." She adjusted the tarpaulin Dot had given her, a habit she'd developed without noticing. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to keep doing exactly what Voss expects you to do. Nothing changes on the surface, nothing that would make him look twice." He stared at her. "You're not going to tell Calloway. I'll tell him when I have something worth telling." She looked at him steadily. "And you're going to tell me everything Voss asks you for from this point forward. Every request, every message, every piece of information he wants. Why would you?" "Because you're not what's wrong here," she said. "And I want what's wrong." She walked back toward the cookhouse. 4 years old, she thought, named Robert. She'd been a widow with no children and no leverage, and she'd lost everything anyway. Denny Falk had a child and a sick wife, designed to be impossible to escape, and he'd been trying to protect them with the only tool Voss had left him. She understood the shape of that trap. She planned to dismantle it from the inside. Voss came on a Thursday, 2 days after her conversation with Denny. She almost missed the arrival. She was in the root cellar, taking a late morning inventory when she heard horses in the yard. Two of them, moving at the unhurried pace of men who believe they're expected. She came up the cellar steps and stood in the cookhouse doorway and got her first proper look at Harlan Voss. He was not what she'd built in her mind. She'd expected sharper edges, someone who looked like what he did. But Harlan Voss looked like someone's prosperous uncle who'd come in a check on the family. Sick perhaps. Well, fed. Well dressed in the way of men who needed you to register that they could afford it. Round, pleasant face. The kind of smile that arrived before the rest of him, as if it were opening doors in advance. He was carrying a tin. Cookies, it turned out. He'd brought cookies. Of course he did, she thought. She stayed in the doorway and watched. He greeted Briggs with the warmth of a long acquaintance, which was remarkable given that Briggs looked like he'd rather shake hands with a fence post. Voss talked easily, made a small observation about the weather that nobody laughed at, gestured pleasantly at the yard, the barn, the general landscape of a man's livelihood. Then he made his offer. She couldn't hear all of it from where she stood, but she'd heard this language before. Current difficulties. Fair price given the circumstances. Better to reach an agreement now than wait for conditions to deteriorate further. The practiced vocabulary of a man who'd given this particular speech many times, who'd learned exactly which words made people feel the sale was their own idea. Briggs's response was short, very short. Voss absorbed it with grace, smiled like refusal was simply the first step of a longer conversation. Began to turn away, and then he turned toward Maggie instead. She didn't look away. He walked to the cookhouse doorway with an unhurried step, extended his hand. "Harlan Voss," he said, warm as a May afternoon. "You must be the new cook I've been hearing about." She took his hand, shook it once. "Margaret Wren." "A pleasure, Mrs. Wren." He smiled. "I hope you're finding it comfortable here." "Quite," she said. He nodded pleasantly, turned to leave, and as he turned she saw it. The inside pocket of his coat briefly visible. The edge of a card case in dark monogrammed leather. And above it, just barely, the corner of a folded document protruding from the pocket's edge. She recognized the letterhead. She'd last seen it 8 months ago. On the paperwork that had taken everything. Voss Banking and Land Trust. Cheyenne, Wyoming. The same institution, the same name, the same looping V. At the start of the signature she had memorized the way. You memorize the shape of the thing that changed your life. Not because you want to, but because it etched itself in while you were still in shock. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't give him a single thing to read in her face. She waited until both horses had cleared the yard gate and the sound of hooves faded into the general quiet of the afternoon. Then she walked around the side of the cookhouse, pressed her back against the wall, stood in the cold and breathed. Him, she thought. Not quite a thought. More like a door opening onto a room she hadn't known was there, very large and very cold. It's him. The man who'd sent a representative to her door 8 days after Thomas's funeral. The man whose signature lived on the letter, explaining in careful professional language that the house and its contents and the small parcel of land attached to it were no longer hers, who'd given her 30 days to vacate a life she'd spent 22 years building, because she was a widow with insufficient income and no male relative to co-sign, which made her a poor risk, which made her grief also an inconvenience in someone's ledger. He hadn't known her name when he signed that paper. She was a file number, a column entry, a liability to be resolved. She stood with her back against the cold siding. "Don't," she told herself. "Not here, not now. You figure out what this means and then you decide what to do with it. You don't come apart in a ranch yard in the middle of a Thursday." She breathed in, out, in, out. The mountains were doing what they always did, being enormous and permanent entirely and unconcerned, with the affairs of people standing at their feet. All right, she thought. All right. She pushed off the wall, went back inside, washed her hands at the basin, started the dough for the evening biscuits. Her hands were steady. She made sure of that. She told Briggs that night after supper. After the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the yard had settled into its nighttime sounds. After she'd cleaned up and banked the fire and there was nothing left to do with her hands that would justify putting it off longer. She sat down at the kitchen table across from him and put both palms flat on the wood. "I need to tell you something," she said. "2 things, actually." He looked up from the supply manifest he'd been staring at without appearing to see it. "All right." She told him about the bank letter first. about the signature on the paperwork that had taken her home, about recognizing the letterhead in Voss' coat pocket that afternoon. She told it straight through, without asking to feel anything in particular about it. Just the facts, in order, the way she'd report a cracked stove flue or a spoiled barrel. When she finished, Briggs was quiet. Not the quiet of a man searching for words. The quiet of a man who took information in fully before responding to it. He got up, poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of her, sat back down. "Same bank," he said. "Same man," she said. "Same signature. I'd know it anywhere." He wrapped both hands around his cup, looked at it. "Then you've got more right to end this than I do," he said. Simple. No theater in it. Maggie looked at him across the table. This man who'd stopped because his horse stopped. Who'd offered her a job because he needed one filled, and hadn't dressed it up as anything more than that, and in doing so had given her the only thing she'd actually needed. Something honest to hold on to. "I also need to tell you about Denny Falk," she said, and she told him that too. Briggs listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet again. Longer this time. "He's been feeding Voss our schedule," he said. "Not a question." "Under coercion," she said. "His wife and son are leverage. He didn't know at the start how the information was being used." Briggs looked at the table. His jaw worked through something. She could see him sorting through what he wanted to do about it versus what made sense to do about it. "What do you want to do?" he said finally. "Keep him in place," she said. "Don't change anything Voss can see. Denny reports to us what Voss asks for, and we decide what actually gets passed along. Turn his own channel against him. Eventually." She curled her hands around her own cup. "But first I need to understand how far this goes. Whether it's just this ranch, or whether Voss has done this before to others. That changes what we can do about it." Briggs looked at her steadily. "You think there are others. Men like Voss don't discover a method and use it once," she said. "They use it until someone stops them." He nodded. "Once. Slowly. All right," he said. "What do you need?" "Time," she said. "And access to every piece of correspondence you've received from Voss or anyone connected to him. Every letter. Every formal notice. Everything. I'll pull it tomorrow." "Good." They sat there a little longer. The fire had burned down to coals, throwing a low orange light across the kitchen. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving through the cottonwoods with a sound like water. "Maggie." He said her name differently than anyone else on the ranch did. Not Mrs. Wren, not ma'am, just her name, quiet and direct. She looked at him. "He took your home," Briggs said. "And then you ended up here on his next target." "Yes." "You didn't know that when you came." "No." A pause. "Does it change things for you?" She thought about that honestly. About whether finding Voss here, of all places, made her want to leave or made her want to stay in a different way than before. "It changes what I want to do about it," she said. "Doesn't change whether I stay." The fire crackled once and settled lower. "Good," he said. Just the one word. But the weight it carried. The fire started on a Friday night, after supper, after the dishes, after most of the men had drifted to the bunkhouse, and the yard had gone quiet in the way it went quiet on cold evenings. Completely, all at once, like a door closing. Maggie was at the basin finishing the last of the cleanup. Elias had gone to check on the horses, which he did every night before bed. A habit he'd had before she arrived and would have long after. She smelled it before she heard anything. Something in the air shifted, sharpened, not smokes of the cookhouse stove or the bunkhouse chimney. Those she knew trial by now, the way you know the breathing of a place you've lived in long enough. This was different. Hotter, carrying, something underneath it that had no business being there. She was as out the door before she'd finished the thought. The small storage structure on the south side of the barn was going. Not fully, not yet. But smoke was pressing out through the gaps in the boards, and she could see the soon-fuse edge of fire through the single high window, the shared wall. That was what mattered. The storage building shared a wall with the barn where Briggs kept his 3 best horses. She was already running. She heard herself shout Briggs's name. Not asking, not warning. Not warning, commanding the way you commanded when there was no time for anything that required a response. She grabbed the 2 water buckets she'd placed beside the cookhouse door 2 weeks ago. She hadn't examined that instinct when she'd put them there. She examined it now and found she was grateful for it. Men came pouring out of the bunkhouse. She didn't wait. The barn door was jammed, smoke pressing through the gap at the bottom now, thin but steady. She hit the door with her shoulder. Once, it gave a little. Again, it swung open. The smoke inside was thick and moving. The horses were panicking. She could hear them before she could see them, that specific sound camels make when they know what danger is and can't get away from it. She pulled the tarpaulin up over her mouth and went in, because she could hear something else. Under the horse sounds, under the crackle of the wall starting to go, a human sound, coughing, Elias. She didn't shout it, she aimed it, the way you aim a voice when you need it to cut through noise and find a specific person. Elias, where are you? A cough. To her left. Stall, she moved toward it. He'd come in for his nightly check, and the door had swung shut in the wind behind him, and in the smoke and the sudden dark he'd gotten turned around. He was on the ground near the far wall, 17 years old, coughing so hard his whole body shook with it. She got her arm under his, got him upright. His weight came onto her shoulders and she took it and moved. He was taller than her by several inches and lighter than any young man, who ate the way he did, had any right to be. She got him to the door, got him through it, got him outside and into the cold air and handed him to August Doyle, who was standing there with a bucket in each hand and an expression on his weathered face that she'd never seen before and didn't have a name for. Then she went back in for the horses. The next hour was buckets and wet sacking, and Briggs moving through the smoke with absolute refusal to be stopped by anything as manageable as a fire. They lost part of the shared wall. 2 stalls on the east side buckled and had to be cleared. But the horses were out. The barn was standing. The fire ran out of what it needed and died under wet canvas in the focused effort of 12 men, who'd stopped being tired the moment the alarm went up. Elias sat on the top fence rail with Dot Haynes's hand on his back, breathing slowly, the color coming back into his face in increments. Maggie sat on an upturned water barrel near the barn door. Her tarpaulin was ruined. Her hair had come loose on one side. Her lungs had filed several complaints that she was setting aside for later. She didn't move for a while, just sat and let her breathing settle. August Doyle walked past, slowed, stopped. He didn't look directly at her, looked at a point somewhere past her left shoulder. That was something, he said, to the general air. The boy needed to get out, she said. He stood there another moment, then walked on, which, from August Doyle, was worth more than most men's speeches. Later, much later, after Elias had been settled and Dot had pressed a cup of something warm into Maggie's hands without explaining what was in it, Briggs came and sat down beside her on the porch steps. He didn't say anything right away. Neither did she. The stars were out in force, Wyoming doing its enormous indifferent thing overhead. The fire started in the corner of the storage building, he said finally. The corner where the lumber from that early delivery was stacked. Maggie said nothing. Denny told you those deliveries were being timed, he said. He did. So whoever set this knew exactly where the risk would be highest. A pause, and when we'd be sitting down. When everyone would be in one place and not watching the yard. Yes. Briggs looked out at the dark for a long moment. I've been telling myself it was accidents, he said. The fences, the equipment. I needed it to be accidents. His voice was even, but something underneath it wasn't. Because if it wasn't accidents, then someone has been doing this deliberately, and I've been. He stopped. Losing, Maggie said. Yeah. You've been losing because someone has been cheating, she said. Those aren't the same thing, and knowing the difference matters. He turned and looked at her. In the dark, his face was shapes and shadow, and the faint glint of gray eyes. We have to do something, he said. I know, she said. I'm working on what? They sat there a while longer, not filling the quiet with anything it didn't need. The mountains were dark shapes against a darker sky. Patient the way only things that have existed for millions of years can be patient. There was something steadying in that. The recognition that the trouble at hand, as real and pressing as it was, existed in the context of something vast and permanent that would outlast it. Eventually Maggie went inside. She didn't sleep for a long time, but when she did, she slept without dreaming, which was the closest thing to rest she'd found since Thomas died. She woke before dawn, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with her notebook open and her second cup cooling at her elbow. She wrote down what she knew, the fence posts, the timed deliveries, the fire and where it started, Denny's account of what Voss had asked for and when. Then she wrote what she still needed. How many properties Voss had acquired in the past 5 years. Whether the acquisitions followed a pattern, whether there was anyone else who'd seen this from the inside and survived it. Someone would know. Someone always knew. The difficulty was that they were scattered and isolated and each one had been made to feel like the only one. Like their bad luck was particular to them, a run of misfortune, rather than the predictable result of a predator with a method. She thought about a name Dot had mentioned weeks ago, once, in passing. A woman who'd practiced law in the county some years back, whose practice had been disrupted. That was the word Dot used, and the word itself told Maggie something. In a way that Dot called unfair before she changed the subject. Carolyn Marsh. Maggie had filed it away at the time without knowing why. Now she knew why. The sun came up slow over the eastern hills while the coffee went cold. Maggie closed her notebook, refilled her cup, built the fire back up for the morning meal. When Dot came in later that morning to collect her husband's coat from the peg by the door, Maggie turned from the stove. "Carolyn Marsh," she said. Dot paused. "What about her?" Dot said. "Does she still practice law?" Dot turned to look at her, those quiet, perceptive eyes taking their time. "She does, out of her home now, smaller scale than before." A pause. "She and her husband lost a great deal about 10 years back. Legal troubles. The kind that aren't really about law." She looked at Maggie steadily. "Why?" Maggie thought about Voss's smile, about cookies brought to someone's door. "I need to write her a letter," Maggie said. Dot nodded once, the nod of someone who'd been waiting without knowing what they were waiting for. "I'll get you her address," she said. "And I know someone who rides past her road twice a week. He can carry a letter faster than the mail." "Good," Maggie said. She turned back to the stove. The morning meal needed to get made. The ranch needed to keep running. Everything on the surface needed to look exactly like it always looked, because didn't fall was still information, and Voss was still watching. And the moment anything changed in the visible pattern was the moment they lost whatever advantage they were building. So she made breakfast. She made it well. And that night, after the kitchen was clean and the fire banked, she sat down and wrote the most precise letter she'd written in her life. Every date, every amount, every signature in the wrong place. Everything she'd seen and documented since that first fence post, and understood that someone had counted on nobody looking closely. Someone had been wrong about that. She sealed the letter, set it by the door for Dot's contact to collect in the morning. Then she opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote at the top, "What comes next?" Underneath it, she began to plan. Carolyn Marsh arrived on a Wednesday. No letter back confirming she was coming. No warning of any kind. Just a buckboard pulling into the yard mid-morning, and a woman climbing down from it with the economy of movement that belongs to people who've stopped spending energy on anything unnecessary. 65 years old. Silver hair cut short and practical. Small in frame but occupying exactly as much space as she decided to. She carried a leather satchel worn soft at the corners, the kind of bag that had been through enough to have stopped caring about appearances. She looked at the ranch, looked at the cookhouse, looked at Maggie standing in the doorway. "You're the one who wrote to me," she said. "I am," Maggie said. "Your letter was precise. I managed accounts for 10 years. Carolyn nodded once, like that explained everything relevant. "Then we have things to discuss." She walked inside without being invited. Maggie liked her immediately. They sat at the kitchen table with Maggie's notebooks open between them. Carolyn went through each page with the attention of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this information, without knowing when it would come. She read without commenting, turned pages at her own pace, stopped occasionally to look at a date or a figure, then moved on. Because that was the thing Maggie hadn't known when she wrote the letter. Carolyn Marsh had been watching Harlan Voss for 11 years. Not because anyone hired her to. Because 11 years ago, Voss had used a manufactured legal dispute to dismantle her husband's law practice from the inside. Documents filed at strategically wrong times. Witnesses approached before testimony could be taken. A professional reputation quietly shredded through channels that left no single obvious fingerprint, only the cumulative result. Her husband had fought it for 3 years, then stopped fighting. The practice was gone. The clients were gone. What had taken 30 years to build was rubble, and the man who built it had nothing left to do but watch. He died 2 years after that. Not from anything a doctor could name precisely. From the particular illness that sets in when a person loses the thing their life was organized around and cannot find a way to reorganize it. Carolyn had kept practicing. Smaller clients, different work. But she'd kept a file. Every piece of information she could gather about Voss's acquisitions, his legal maneuvers, The pattern of properties that passed through his hands under circumstances that never looked quite right when you examined them closely. "I've had pieces," she said. She turned a page in Maggie's notebook and stopped. "Looked at the column of dates cross-referenced against incident reports. But I never had the accounting, the supply invoices, the internal timing documented from inside the operation." She looked up. "How did you know to track this?" "Because the bank that took my home didn't give me enough warning," Maggie said. "So I decided that wherever I went next, I'd pay attention to the dates." Carolyn looked at her for a moment. "Good," she said, and went back to the notebook. Well, they worked through the morning. Briggs came in once, poured coffee for all three of them without being asked, and left again. It was the right call, and he knew it. By noon, they had the shape of a plan, not complete, not without risk, but built on something solid. Carolyn set down her pen. "Before we go further," she said, "I need to tell you something about my situation." She looked at Maggie directly. "I have motive that any decent lawyer would flag immediately. 11 years of documented interest in this man. If this goes to federal court, and it should go to federal court, my involvement will be scrutinized. Does that stop you from helping?" Maggie said. "No," Carolyn said. "It means I need to be careful about how I help. The evidence has to be airtight. My role has to be properly framed." A pause. "And I need you to understand that I am not a neutral party." "Neither am I," Maggie said. "He took my house." Carolyn looked at her for another moment, then something in her expression settled. "Then we understand each other," she said. "The plan took 3 days to build properly. Not quickly, not cleanly. The way real plans come together. Through disagreement and revision, and someone saying that won't hold, and someone else saying then what will, and the grinding, unglamorous work of finding every weak point before someone else found it for you." Denny Falk sat at the table for the second day of planning. That was Maggie's insistence. Briggs had reservations he didn't try to hide. Carolyn had questions she asked plainly. But Maggie held the position. "He knows how Voss communicates," she said. "He knows the timing. He knows what Voss considers reliable and what makes him suspicious." She looked at Briggs. "We need what he knows." Briggs looked at Denny across the table, long and level. The kind of look that takes full inventory. So Denny looked back. Didn't argue. Didn't explain himself further. Just sat with the bearing of a man who knew what he'd done and wasn't going to dress it in better clothes than it deserved. "My wife's name is Clara," Denny said. "My boy is Robert. I'm not asking you to forgive what I did. I'm asking you to let me help fix it."
The kitchen was quiet.
"All right," Briggs said. One word, but he meant it, and Denny knew he meant it, and that was enough to move forward on. The plan had 2 phases. The first was Carolyn filing a legal motion. Quiet, procedural, buried in the kind of paperwork that didn't flag anything to anyone watching from the outside, that would place Clara Falk and young Robert under a temporary protective order, a legal shield. It wouldn't make Voss powerless over the debt, but it would make any overt move against the family visible in court records. It would cost him something to act against them. That had to happen before anything else, because Denny could only do what they needed him to do if his family was safe, not safer. Safe. Carolyn rode to the county seat herself on a Thursday and came back that evening with confirmation. She set the paper on the kitchen table in front of Denny without ceremony. He picked it up, read it once all the way through, set it down. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you," he said to Carolyn. Then he looked at Maggie. "Thank you." Maggie refilled his coffee. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "You've got work to do." The second phase was the bait. Denny would pass word through the channel he'd been using for months. The same method, the same timing. Nothing that would signal a change. That Briggs Calloway was transferring significant cash payment out of the ranch on Saturday afternoon. Payment received for a cattle sale. Substantial amount. Route taking him along the South Road past the old Fenwick property line. Just 2 of them making the run, Denny's message would suggest. Briggs and his cook, running the errand together. Unguarded. Routine, the kind of opportunity that appeared when it was stretched thin and had to move money with whatever help he had available. The kind of opportunity a man like Voss couldn't let sit. That was the piece Maggie had thought hardest about. Whether Voss would come himself or simply send people. "He'll come," she said. Briggs looked at her. "Sir, he's been running this method for years, and no one has ever pushed back hard enough to make him cautious," she said. "He thinks he's untouchable. Men who believe that stop delegating the parts they want to enjoy. They come themselves because watching is half of what they're paying themselves for. Carolyn said nothing, but she nodded once. She'd watched this man for 11 years. She'd seen the pattern. There was also the matter of the second notebook. Maggie hadn't shown it to Briggs yet. Not because she was hiding it from him, she wasn't, but because the timing needed to be right. Working on the records Carolyn had kept combined with county deed transfers and bank filings, going back 4 years, Maggie had built a parallel document over the previous 2 weeks. 5 ranches in 3 counties that had followed the same sequence, unexplained incidents eroding the operation, discounted forced sale and acquisition by a holding company that traced through 2 layers of intermediary paperwork back to Voss Banking and Land Trust. 5 ranches, and 1 house in Cheyenne. 1 widow with a debt and no leverage and 30 days to clear out. 6, if you counted her. She'd counted her. Every entry documented in her boarding house handwriting. The same hand that had never lost a penny in 10 years of managing her aunt's accounts. The same hand that didn't miss things. She'd give it to the federal officer at the right moment. Not before. If Voss saw it too early, he'd know the scope of what they had, and men who understood the scope of what they were facing had time to destroy things. Saturday, she decided after. Friday night, Briggs found her on the porch steps, late. The ranch had gone quiet an hour ago. The sky was doing its enormous, star-crowded thing from one horizon to the other. He sat down beside her without asking. She didn't mind. She'd stopped minding his presence without announcement some time ago, which was itself something worth noticing. They didn't talk for a while. 2 people who'd gotten used to each other's silences sitting in one. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she said. You sure about this? Not a question. More like he was checking whether anything had shifted since they last discussed it. No, she said honestly. But I'm doing it anyway. He made a sound low in his chest, brief. It took her a moment to recognize it as something close to a laugh, because she hadn't heard that sound from him before. Nervous? She considered it genuinely angry, she said, which turns out to be more useful. He nodded, looked out at the dark. Maggie. The way he said her name had changed somewhere in the past weeks. She hadn't marked the exact moment, just noticed one day that it sounded different, not like a name he was using, but like a name he'd claimed the right to say. Whatever happens tomorrow, you should know that this ranch. He stopped. Tried again. You've been good for this place. For the people on it. She looked at him sideways. Don't go soft on me the night before a plan goes into motion. That sound again. Low. More settled this time. Wouldn't dream of it, he said. They sat there until the cold got definitive about itself and made staying out impractical. She went inside, slept 4 hours, real sleep, not the restless circling kind, woke before dawn, made coffee, got to work. Saturday came in cold and clear, no clouds, hard light. The kind of air that made everything look precise and real, like the world had been outlined in ink overnight. Maggie stood at the cookhouse window and looked at it and thought, good. But clear days meant clear sight lines, and clear sight lines, fewer directions from which surprises could come. By 9 in the morning, the pieces were in position. Carolyn had a contact, a federal land officer from the county seat named Aldrich, who'd reviewed the pattern evidence she'd presented and agreed it warranted his presence. He was behind the old equipment shed at the property's east edge with 2 deputies. Not visible, close enough to move when needed. August Doyle and 2 of the longer-tenured ranch hands were spread along the south road. Far enough back that anyone coming from town wouldn't see them. Close enough to converge fast. Elias was in the cookhouse with instructions to stay there. He'd argued. Maggie had given him the look of those over sick Nikin, full of people who occasionally thought they had better ideas than she did. He'd stayed. Probably. Denny had passed the message 4 days ago. Confirmation had come back through the usual channel. Oblique, the way Voss always communicated. Never a direct statement that could be cited later. That the information had been received. Now it was just waiting, which was always the hardest part. Briggs brought the wagon around at noon. 2 horses. A strong box in the back that contained, for anyone who looked, rocks wrapped in canvas, weighted to match the feel of what the message had described. Maggie climbed up onto the seat. Briggs looked at her. You didn't have to come, he said. I know, she said. He picked up the reins. They went. The south road was quiet. Flat at first, went from the lobby line where the old Fenwick land started. The cottonwood trees lining the road were bare now, November having arrived and made its intentions clear. Their branches made clean lines against the sky. Maggie sat straight, hands in her lap, watching in the road ahead. Briggs didn't talk. She didn't either. There wasn't anything that needed saying that hadn't been said already. The wagon went around the long curve. And there was Harlan Voss, not alone. He had a man on either side of him, one she recognized as the man who'd accompanied him on his first visit, and one she didn't know. Three of them spread across the road in the arrangement of men who intend to stop something. Voss self was on a gray horse, still well-dressed, still wearing that face that defaulted to pleasantry, until the wagon came fully into view, until he saw Maggie sitting on the seat beside Briggs. The pleasantry shifted, just slightly, just for a moment, like a lamp flame in a cross-draft, there and then back, but she'd seen it go, because she wasn't supposed to matter. The message Denny had sent described Briggs and his cook making a routine run. He'd expected her to be unremarkable, background, not someone who'd be watching his face for exactly this. He recovered fast. Men like him always did. Calloway, he said, warm, easy, like this was an accidental crossing of paths between neighbors. I heard you were making a delivery. You heard wrong, Briggs said. This is a private road. Everything out here's private eventually. Voss smiled. That's rather the nature of the territory. His man on the left moved toward the back of the wagon, toward the strong box, and that was when August Doyle stepped out of the tree line. Then two more ranch hands. Then from the east the sound of Aldrich and his deputies moving into position. Voss heard it. His gray horse shifted under him. His man's hand moved toward his side and then stopped, because Doyle's rifle was already leveled, and Doyle was not a man who pointed things without meaning them. Voss went still. His eyes moved across the scene with the fast, cold arithmetic of a man who'd always had an exit, calculating whether he had one now. Mr. Voss. Carolyn Marsh came around the side of the equipment shed, satchel in hand, steady as a surveyor's plumb line. I believe you remember me. The warmth left his face, all of it, at once. Carolyn, he said, flat now. The pleasantry stripped down to the man underneath it. 11 years, she said. I've been patient. She held up the satchel. I'm done being patient. Denny Falk came forward last. He'd been waiting near the fence line where the cottonwoods thinned, far enough back that Voss hadn't placed him, close enough that when he walked into the open, Voss saw his face clearly, and something crossed Voss's expression Maggie hadn't seen from him before. Real surprise. The surprise of a man who'd believed a mechanism would keep working, because it always had, discovering it had stopped. Denny stopped 10 feet from the wagon. He didn't look at Briggs or at Carolyn or at the federal photographer officer moving into position behind him. He looked at Voss. My son's name is Robert, he said, and he's 4 years old, and he's somewhere you can't reach. Voss said nothing. I'll testify to everything, Denny said. Every message, every request, every piece of information I passed on, and every conversation about what would happen to my family if I didn't cooperate. All of it. In front of a federal court. His voice was steady, because Clara and Robert were safe, because the protective order meant they were beyond Voss's leverage, because Maggie had made sure of that before she'd asked anything of him. Every word. Officer Aldrich stepped forward. He said what needed saying. Voss's man on the left tried something. Doyle's rifle moved 2 inches. The man reconsidered. Voss dismounted. He didn't do it quietly. Men who'd operated without accountability for years rarely did. He spoke in the clipped, controlled tone of someone accustomed to being listened to, even when the situation had turned. He mentioned a lawyer by name. He mentioned the county commissioner by first name. He looked at Carolyn with the expression of a man who'd once had power over her and was testing whether that still counted for anything. Carolyn looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had spent 11 years waiting for exactly this moment and was not going to st a single second of it on anything except being fully present in it. There's also this, Maggie said. She reached into her coat, drew out the second notebook and the folded set of documents she and Carolyn had prepared over the past week. Copies of deed transfers, supply records, financial filings, all cross-referenced, all dated, all documented in the precise, unambiguous hand of a woman who had managed accounts for 10 years without losing a penny. She handed them to Aldrich. He opened the first page. Red turned to the second. His expression changed. These cover other properties, he said. 5 of them, Maggie said, at 3 counties. Same pattern of incidents preceding each sale. Same holding company as the buyer. That company traces back to Voss Banking and Land Trust through 2 intermediary entities. She paused. I was number 6. Before I ended up here, Aldrich looked at her, then at Voss. Voss was looking at the notebook, not at Aldrich, not at Carolyn. At the notebook in Maggie's hands, with the expression of a man who recognized meticulous records, because he kept meticulous records himself, and who understood exactly what those pages represented. Where did you get this? He said. Not to Aldrich, to her. From your invoices, she said. From county deed records. From my own experience of how you operate. She held his gaze without difficulty. You signed the paper that took my house, Mr. Voss. 8 days after my husband died. I'd know your signature anywhere. He looked at her. For the first time since she'd watched him ride into Briggs's yard carrying a tin of cookies, Harlan Voss had nothing to say. The smile was gone. The warmth was gone. The entire careful performance of a reasonable man making unfortunate but necessary business decisions. All of it gone. What remained was a man standing in a cold Wyoming field, discovering that the person he'd least considered had been paying the closest attention. The handcuffs went on without drama. Aldrich was efficient and professional, and the whole thing was accomplished in less time than it took to make a pot of coffee. Voss's man on the right made a rapid calculation and stated his willingness to cooperate before anyone asked. The man on the left went with Voss, quiet now in the way of someone who'd read the situation correctly and was already thinking about what came next for him. The wagon sat in the road. The cottonwood stood bare against the November sky. And then it was just them. Briggs and Maggie and Carolyn and Denny Falk and August Doyle with his rifle lowered now, and Elias Prue, who had absolutely not stayed in the cookhouse and was standing 30 yards back, attempting to look like he'd been there all along. Nobody said anything for a moment, because sometimes the thing you've worked toward arrives and it's quieter than you expected. Not empty, just weighted. The weight of something that actually happened, settling into the space where the anticipation of it had been. Carolyn spoke first. I'll need to file the additional documentation with the federal court by Wednesday, she said. Practical, immediate, already moving to the next required step. The 5 property record changes the scope considerably. This becomes a territorial case, not a county matter. She looked at Maggie. You should be prepared to testify. It may take months. I've got time, Maggie said. Briggs looked at her sideways at that. Something in his expression she didn't examine in front of others. Doyle cleared his throat. So, he looked at Pete in particular. Are we done standing in a road? We're done, Briggs said. Good. Doyle turned to Elias. You weren't supposed to be here. I was just. Don't, Doyle said, and walked back toward the ranch with Elias scrambling to keep pace. Carolyn got back up into her buckboard. She had work ahead of her, more than she'd had in 11 years, and she clearly wanted to start it. She picked up her reins, paused. Mrs. Wren, she said. Maggie looked up. 11 years, Carolyn said. I've been building a case for 11 years. Collecting pieces. She held Maggie's gaze. You did in 3 weeks what I couldn't do in 11. You had the legal knowledge, Maggie said. I had the ledgers. You had the ledgers and the sense to use them and the willingness to walk into a burning barn first. Carolyn looked at her steadily. Don't do yourself the disservice of calling that nothing. She drove off down the road. The buckboard raised a thin line of dust behind it. The road was empty again, the wagon, the 2 horses. The strong box full of canvas-wrapped rocks. Briggs and Maggie. They drove back slow, no reason to hurry now. November light coming in gold and low across the hills. The kind of light that made the ordinary landscape of a working ranch look like something worth painting. Neither of them spoke for a while. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. The ranch came into view as the road curved north. The buildings, the barn with its partially rebuilt east wall, still raw new lumber against weathered old. The cookhouse with its steady chimney putting up a thin line of smoke into the cold afternoon air. Briggs pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard. Neither of them climbed down immediately. The horses stood patient the way horses did, tails moving against the cold. Briggs said, Well, Maggie, a pause. You planning on staying through winter? He asked. She looked at him. This man, this enormous, stubbornly decent man who sees what he and meant what he's, and had said what he graved behind the cookhouse that told her things about him that he'd never tell her with words. Who'd asked her one straightforward question on a dirt road in October. and changed the direction of everything that followed. Mo. She looked out at the yard, at the barn, at the cookhouse with its stove she'd fixed, and its root cellar she'd organized, and its kitchen that had become, over 6 weeks, unmistakably hers. She thought about October, about the particular exhaustion of a person who has tried every door and found them all closed and has run out of road. She thought about Thomas, about the shape of a life with someone and the shape of what remains when they're gone, about the fact that grief didn't have a finish line. It just changed, became something you carried differently. Less like a weight and more like a scar, which was proof that something real had happened, that you had loved someone well and been loved in return, and that those 22 years were not erased by the 8 months since. She thought about a pressed white tarpaulin left without explanation, about Elias hauling 40 gallons of water without being asked twice, about Carolyn Marsh driving alone to a ranch because a letter from a stranger had finally given her the missing piece she'd needed for 11 years, about a boy named Robert who was 4 years old and safe, about 5 ranches that now had someone documenting what had been done to them. Not because I have nowhere else to go, she thought. She turned back to Briggs. I'll stay, she said, not because I have nowhere else to go. She held his gaze steady, because this is where I choose to be. Something moved in his face. That slow, quiet shift she'd learned to read over 6 weeks of working beside him. The one that said more than he'd put into words. All right, he said. Simple. No decoration. Just all right. They climbed down from the wagon, unhitched the horses, put the strong box of rocks back in the equipment shed, where it would probably confuse someone eventually. The men came in for supper at 6, the way they always did. 12 of them. Dusty and tired from a day's work that had gone on, regardless of what was happening on the South Road, because ranches didn't pause for dramatic events. The cattle still needed checking, the fences still needed walking, the hay still needed moving. They filed in and found their seats, and the room smelled like it always smelled at 6 o'clock now. Like food made by someone who understood what it was for. Elias ate with the focused determination of someone who had spent considerably more calories than expected on standing in a field where he wasn't supposed to be. Doyle was at the far end of the table, second plate already in progress, saying nothing about the afternoon the way he said nothing about most things. Dot Haynes sat with her husband at the table for the first time since Maggie had arrived. Not her habit on ordinary evenings, but this wasn't an ordinary evening, and Dot had a sense for which evenings required her presence. Maggie stood near the stove, not because she needed to manage anything. Everything was done, the meal made and served and handling itself. She stood there because she liked the vantage point, liked seeing the room from this angle, liked the particular quality of a space full of people eating well at the end of a hard day. She'd known this her whole adult life, that feeding people was not a small thing, that showing up reliably with something made with care was not a minor act. The person who could be depended on to do this day after day without fail was holding something together that couldn't be held together any other way. She'd known it at 20, at 40, at 58, standing in a cookhouse in Wyoming that she'd come to by accident and stayed in by choice. It was still true. Briggs came in last. He always came in last. She understood that this was deliberate. He ate last because he'd made sure everything outside was Little's first, the same way he'd arrived at everything in his life, which was to say carefully and without announcing the care involved. He sat at his end of the table, looked down the length of it, looked at the faces of his people, these 12 men who'd been eating disaster before she arrived and had been eating well every day since, and who'd fought a fire and laid a trap and done what was asked of them, without requiring extended explanations. Then he looked at Maggie. She looked back, a nod, the one she knew by now, the one that didn't require translation. She turned back to the stove. Outside, the November night was settling in the way Wyoming nights settled. Completely, with full commitment, cold coming down off the mountains like a fact that had always been true and was simply restating itself. The stars would be out in force later. They always were. The fire crackled in the belly of the stove she had fixed and learned and made her own. Someone at the table said something. Laughter moved through the room, easy and warm. The kind of laughter that happened when people had eaten well and the immediate danger had passed, and they were among people they trusted. Maggie reached for the coffee pot, got back to work. She had tomorrow's bread to plan for. She had a court testimony to prepare, probably. She had a ranch to keep fed through a whining winter, which was its own kind of battle, and one she intended to win. She was 58 years old. She was a widow with a carpet bag, a notebook full of dates, and a tarpaulin she'd worn. So often it had shaped itself to her. She had lived through loss that should have ended her, and walked 3 weeks across hard country, and been turned away 6 times by people who looked at her and saw only what she wasn't. She was still here. She had chosen to be here, and in a cookhouse on a Wyoming ranch on a cold November night, with 12 people at the table behind her, and coffee on the stove, and the fire burning steady and true. Margaret Wren understood, in the quiet way that real understanding arrives, without fanfare, without drama, settling into the bones like warmth after cold, that this was what surviving looked like when it became something more than surviving. This was what it looked like to stay, not because you had no other choice, because you found the place worth staying in and decided to.